September 23, 1940. 4:30 in the afternoon. A dusty vehicle rolls through the gates of Camp Holabird in Baltimore, Maryland. 30 minutes remain before the deadline expires. Behind the wheel sits a 56-year-old freelance engineer who had refused this job just 8 weeks earlier. Beside him, the chief engineer of a company so broke it had disbanded its entire design department months ago. And in the cargo bed of this strange little machine sits nothing less than the future of mechanized warfare. The vehicle weighs 1,900 pounds. The army wanted 1,300. The engine produces 45 horsepower. The competition will eventually field 60. The company that built it employs fewer than 20 workers. The companies that will steal its design employ tens of thousands. Nobody watching that prototype roll through the gates could have known what it would become. Within 5 years, this vehicle and its descendants would carry American soldiers across every battlefield of the Second World War. Generals would call it the greatest contribution America made to modern warfare. Dwight Eisenhower would rank it alongside the bulldozer, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 aircraft as vital equipment for victory in Africa and Europe. More than 647,000 would roll off assembly lines by 1945. The vehicle would become so iconic that soldiers would name it, write songs about it, and mourn its destruction like the death of a comrade. The company that invented it would build fewer than 2,700. This is the story of the American Bantam Car Company, a bankrupt automaker in a small Pennsylvania town that designed and built the original Jeep prototype in 49 days, only to watch the United States government hand its blueprints to competitors who had the factories to mass produce them. It is a story of genius exploited, of wartime necessity trumping fairness, and of an invention so consequential that it changed how armies would fight forever. The men who built it received almost nothing. The town that housed the factory lost it to demolition. The engineer who drew the plans died in obscurity, his original drawings later burned by a relative. But the machine they created together helped liberate a continent, chase the Japanese across the Pacific, and establish American military dominance for generations. To understand how a dying car company in Butler, Pennsylvania became the unlikely birthplace of America's most iconic military vehicle, we need to go back to the years before the war. Back to a time when the United States Army still relied on horses for reconnaissance, when Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics were about to shock the world, and when the biggest automakers in America looked at the military's impossible specifications and walked away. The American Bantam Car Company did not walk away. It could not afford to. The company traced its origins to 1929, when Sir Herbert Austin of England's Austin Motor Company shipped 4 tiny Austin 7 automobiles to the New York National Automobile Show. Austin had revolutionized the British car market with small, affordable vehicles that ordinary families could own. He wanted an American partner to bring the same concept across the Atlantic. A Delaware businessman named Elias Ritt won the license and established production at a former steel car plant in Butler, Pennsylvania, a sprawling 29-acre complex. The location was strategic. Butler sat at the heart of Pennsylvania's industrial belt, with rail connections to Pittsburgh and access to skilled workers from the region's steel mills. The cars were tiny, just over 10 feet long on a 75-inch wheelbase, powered by a 747 cubic centimeter engine producing about 13 horsepower. With a top speed of 50 miles per hour and fuel economy of 40 miles per gallon. The coupe was priced at $445, within $5 of a Ford Model A. For Americans weary of the massive, gas-guzzling automobiles that dominated the market, the Austin offered a thrifty alternative. Initial sales looked promising. The company built more than 8,500 units in 1930, and celebrities including Babe Ruth and Ernest Hemingway were photographed with the compact cars. But the Great Depression gutted the market for new vehicles of any size, and cheap second-hand full-size automobiles flooded every street corner in America. Why buy a tiny new car when you could purchase a used Cadillac for the same price? Production collapsed. 1,279 cars in 1931, then fewer still. On December 1st, 1934, production stopped entirely. Federal courts ordered liquidation. The American Austin Car Company was finished. On August 21st, 1935, a liquidating trustee sold everything, the factory, the tooling, the brand name, all of it, to a southern auto dealer named Roy Evans for $5,000 in cash plus assumption of roughly $214,000 in debt. Evans secured a $250,000 loan from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, hired back the original body designer for just $300, and formally incorporated the American Bantam Car Company on June 2, 1936. The redesigned engine now produced 20 horsepower, a significant improvement through a new aluminum induction system and higher compression ratio. The body was updated with more modern styling. The price remained competitive, but sales remained anemic. Roughly 2,000 units sold in 1938, 1,225 in 1939, just 800 in 1940. Americans simply were not interested in small cars, not when gasoline was cheap and the roads were built for big vehicles. By June of 1940, the engineering department had been disbanded entirely. The factory sat largely idle with a skeleton crew. American Bantam was functionally bankrupt, surviving on government surplus contracts and the desperate hope that something might save it from total extinction. Something did, but not in the way anyone expected. The United States Army's road to the Jeep began in April 1937 at the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia. The Army faced a fundamental problem. Modern warfare was increasingly mechanized, but the military still relied on horses, motorcycles with sidecars, and modified passenger cars for reconnaissance and light transport duties. None of these solutions worked well. Horses were slow, required constant feeding and veterinary care, and were terrified by artillery fire. Motorcycles were fast but provided no protection, carried minimal equipment, and performed poorly off-road. Converted passenger cars were too heavy, too fragile, and completely unsuited to rough terrain. The Army needed something new, something that combined the best qualities of each without the limitations. Captain Robert Howe and Master Sergeant Melvin Wiley built a prototype at Fort Benning using scrap parts, including salvaged American Austin components. The low-slung machine gun carrier required its two-man crew to lie prone while operating it. They called it the belly flopper. It was impractical for cross-country travel, uncomfortable for crews, and limited in capability. But it planted a seed. The Army needed a light reconnaissance vehicle to replace horses and motorcycles permanently. Something small enough to be maneuverable through forest trails, rugged enough to handle any terrain from desert sand to mountain passes, simple enough to be maintained by ordinary soldiers in the field with basic tools, and cheap enough to be produced in massive quantities. After France fell to Germany in June 1940, urgency intensified exponentially. Hitler's armored divisions had conquered Western Europe in just 6 weeks. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had demonstrated that modern warfare belonged to machines, not cavalry. The German Wehrmacht used motorcycles, light vehicles, and armored cars for reconnaissance, allowing their panzer divisions to move with devastating speed and precision. The American Army had nothing comparable. The Quartermaster Corps convened a technical subcommittee on June 19th, meeting at the Bantam factory itself. The location was not accidental. Bantam had been building small vehicles with minimal resources for years. Major Robert Howe, now promoted from his Fort Benning days, worked with civilian engineers from Camp Holabird and Bantam's chief engineer Harold Christ to hammer out specifications for a quarter-ton four-wheel-drive reconnaissance vehicle. On July 11, 1940, the Quartermaster Corps issued formal invitations to bid to 135 domestic automotive manufacturers. The specifications were extraordinarily demanding. Four-wheel drive, with a 2-speed transfer case for both high and low-range operation, capacity for a 3-person crew with 660 pounds of payload. Wheelbase, no more than 75 inches, later raised to 80 inches after engineers protested the original was too restrictive. Maximum height of 36 inches with the windshield folded flat, allowing the vehicle to present a low profile under fire. Empty weight no more than approximately 1,300 pounds. Minimum 85 foot-pounds of engine torque. Must be able to mount a .30 caliber Browning machine gun. Fold-down windshield, blackout lights for night operations, and capability to ford 18 inches of water. The timeline was nearly suicidal. Bids were due by July 22nd, just 11 days later. A running prototype had to be delivered within 49 days of contract award. 70 pre-production test vehicles were due within 75 days. This was an absurd schedule for developing an entirely new vehicle type. Most automotive development programs took years, not weeks. Most critically, the 1,300-pound weight limit was physically impossible for a four-wheel drive vehicle carrying 660 pounds of payload plus a crew of 3. The math simply did not work. A transfer case alone weighed over 50 pounds. 2 axles with differentials, another 200. Engine, transmission, frame, body, fuel tank, wheels, tires, steering, seats. The components added up relentlessly. Both Karl Probst and Willys Overland's chief engineer Delmar Roos independently concluded the same thing. The final production Jeep would weigh 2,453 pounds, nearly double the original specification. Of the 135 companies invited, only 2 submitted bids by the July 22 deadline, American Bantam and Willys Overland. Every major automaker in America declined. General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, Studebaker, Packard, Hudson, 130 other companies. All of them said no. The deadline was too short, the specifications too extreme, the initial contract too small, just 70 vehicles. And the major manufacturers were tooled for large, heavy passenger cars, not tiny reconnaissance vehicles that might never see mass production. Why risk resources on a seemingly hopeless project that promised minimal profit? Willys Overland submitted a cost estimate, but requested 120 days to build a prototype instead of 49. The extension was refused. The Army needed prototypes immediately, not in 4 months. Bantam was the only company that submitted complete blueprints and committed to the brutal 49-day deadline. Bantam won the contract by default, the only bidder willing to attempt what everyone else considered madness. Now the company needed someone who could actually design the vehicle in time, and for that, they turned to a man who had initially refused to help. Karl Knight Probst was born October 20th, 1883, in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, the son of a country doctor. He grew up tinkering with machinery, fascinated by the new automobiles that were beginning to appear on American roads. He studied engineering at Ohio State University, graduating in 1906, overlapping briefly with Charles Kettering, the brilliant inventor who would later develop the electric starter. Probst then entered the automobile industry immediately after graduation. His career spanned the golden age of American automotive engineering. He worked for Chalmers, one of the early automobile pioneers, for Lozier, building luxury cars that competed with Rolls-Royce, for Peerless, another prestige marque, and for Milburn Electric, where his redesign work in the mid-1910s made Milburn cars significantly lighter than competing electrics without sacrificing performance or durability. Weight reduction would become his specialty. He rose to chief engineer at the REO Motor Car Company, founded by Ransom Eli Olds after leaving Oldsmobile. REO built tough, reliable trucks and cars throughout the 1910s and 20s. Probst earned a reputation as an engineer who could stretch performance from modest resources, who could build vehicles that were both economical and effective. In the early 1920s, following a health crisis, he left the automobile business for real estate investment. For several years he prospered. Then the 1929 crash wiped him out completely. He lost everything. He returned to freelance automotive consulting, taking whatever work he could find during the depths of the Depression. His son, Charles, later recalled that Probst possessed an almost supernatural ability to assess mechanical components. He would pick up random objects, heft them in his hand, and declare things like, "This weighs 15 ounces, will cost 58 cents to manufacture, and will take 47 minutes to machine." His estimates were consistently accurate. He had spent decades handling automotive components and had developed an intuitive understanding of weight, cost, and manufacturing complexity that few engineers could match. When Bantam President Frank Fenn telephoned Probst in Detroit on July 17, 1940, Probst declined. He was too busy with other consulting work. He foresaw insurmountable difficulties in the Army's specifications. The weight limit was unachievable. The timeline was absurd. And Bantam was a nearly bankrupt company, with no engineering staff and minimal resources. Why tie himself to a project that seemed doomed to failure? But Bantam was desperate, and desperation has a way of finding leverage. The company worked its contacts up through the chain to William Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, who was now serving as Commissioner of Industrial Production on the National Defense Advisory Commission. President Roosevelt had recruited Knudsen to transform America's manufacturing capacity for potential war production. When Knudsen made a request, people listened. Knudsen telephoned Probst personally, applying what sources describe as the strongest possible pressure. Knudsen reportedly told him, "This is important to the country. Forget your office. If you bring this off, and I know you can, we will see that you get some money." It was not a generous offer. It was barely an offer at all. But Probst understood what Knudsen was really saying. America might soon be at war. The army needed this vehicle. And Probst was one of the few engineers in the country with the experience and skill to design it in the time available. Probst left Detroit at 2 in the afternoon on July 17th. He stopped en route at Spicer Manufacturing in Toledo to pick up a small transmission and at Electric Auto Light for a wiring harness. He arrived at the Butler factory that evening, not entirely sure what he would find. What he found was significant. Harold Christ, Bantam's chief engineer, a veteran of Marmon and 18 years at Stutz building racing cars and luxury automobiles, had already been working on the vehicle concept. Christ and mechanics Chester Hempfling and Ralph Turner had begun fabricating parts and developing preliminary designs. This is a critical historical nuance that many accounts overlook. Probst formalized and drafted engineering blueprints from work that Christ's team had already begun. The Jeep did not spring fully formed from Probst's imagination. It was a collaborative effort from the very beginning. Probst worked nearly non-stop through July 17th to the 19th, dusting off long abandoned drafting tables in the deserted design offices. The factory was nearly empty. The engineering department disbanded months earlier, but the drafting equipment remained, covered in dust. Probst set up shop and began translating Christ's concepts into precise engineering drawings. By July 19th, a Friday, the preliminary design was complete. He reportedly knocked off and went to the movies, taking a few hours to relax after 3 days of intense work. By July 20th and 21st, finalized blueprints, cost calculations, and supplier specifications were ready for submission. The design deliberately exceeded the 1,300-pound weight limit, targeting approximately 1,850 pounds, which Probst deemed the minimum achievable for the required capabilities. He was honest about this from the start. The Army's weight specification was fantasy, and he would not pretend otherwise. On Monday, July 22nd at 9 in the morning, Probst and Fenn drove to Camp Holabird in Baltimore to submit the bid. Representatives from Ford, Crosley, and Willys were also present. Only Bantam had a complete submission with full blueprints and a commitment to the 49-day deadline. At the presentation, when Bantam's Washington representative began hedging on the weight, trying to make the vehicle sound lighter than it was, Probst intervened with characteristic honesty. "That is not quite right," he said. "The fact is that the vehicle weighs about 1,850 pounds, and we do not see a way to take much off it." A captain squatted down beside the scale model, lifted the rear wheels off the ground, and declared, "Feels like 1,200 pounds to me." The presiding colonel accepted this assessment, perhaps understanding that the official weight limit was unattainable and that getting a working prototype mattered more than paperwork compliance. The Quartermaster Corps awarded the contract to Bantam in approximately 30 minutes. Multiple sources indicate that Probst initially worked without salary, volunteering his expertise for the good of the country. He was ultimately paid only $200 for his entire contribution to the Jeep's design, one of the most influential military vehicles in history. With the contract awarded around August 5, 1940, Bantam had 49 days to deliver a running prototype. Not drawings, not a mock-up. A fully functional vehicle that could be driven, tested, and evaluated by Army engineers. Harold Christ led the construction team at the Butler factory, working around the clock with a skeleton crew of roughly 15 employees. They had no time for custom tooling or purpose-built components. Everything had to be sourced from existing suppliers and assembled in the shop. The approach was pragmatic and ingenious. Use off-the-shelf components wherever possible, since Bantam had no budget for developing new parts. Adapt existing hardware to meet the Army's requirements. Build what could not be bought. The key components sourced for the prototype included a Continental BY4112 inline 4-cylinder engine, producing approximately 45 horsepower and 86 foot-pounds of torque from 112 cubic inches. This was an industrial engine, not designed for automotive use, but it was available and met the torque specification. A Warner Gear T84 3-speed synchronized manual transmission provided the gears. A Spicer Model 18 2-speed transfer case handled the four-wheel drive requirements, and Spicer Model 40 front and rear axles, sourced from the Studebaker Champion passenger car, provided the drive units. The body was fabricated by the York Hoover Body Corporation in York, Pennsylvania, working from Probst's drawings. A backup handmade body was reportedly prepared at the Bantam factory in case York Hoover's delivery was late. The prototype, designated the BRC Pilot, short for Bantam Reconnaissance Car, was nicknamed the Blitz Buggy by the workers who built it. The name was a reference to the German blitzkrieg tactics that were driving the army's urgency, a bit of dark humor for men working 18-hour days to meet a crushing deadline. They succeeded. The Blitz Buggy was completed and running by approximately September 21, 1940, 2 days ahead of schedule. It weighed roughly 1,940 pounds, well over the 1,300-pound specification, but within what engineers considered the physical minimum for the required capabilities. No one had ever built a four-wheel drive vehicle this light with this much capability. Bantam had achieved the impossible, or at least come closer than anyone else had managed. On September 23rd, Probst and Christ drove the vehicle approximately 170 miles from Butler to Camp Holabird. They had completed only limited testing. They did not know if the vehicle would survive the journey, but they had no choice. The deadline was 5 o'clock that afternoon. Probst later recalled the journey with a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. We drove slowly at first, telling ourselves it was important to break the vehicle in, but as we wound through the hills of Pennsylvania, the 5 o'clock deadline we had worked toward for those 7 weeks seemed to come closer. To make Holabird come closer too, we were soon pushing the car to the limit, and it really was fun. They arrived at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon on September 23rd, 1940, 30 minutes before the 5 o'clock deadline. The Blitz Buggy had survived its first real test, 170 miles of Pennsylvania roads. Major H.J. Laws, commandant of the Camp Holabird Test Center, was among the first to drive the Bantam prototype. He was the Army's most experienced vehicle evaluator, having tested every reconnaissance vehicle the services had considered for 2 decades. His reaction was emphatic and immediate. "I have driven every unit the services have purchased for the last 20 years, he told Probst. "I can judge them in 15 minutes. This vehicle is going to be absolutely outstanding. I believe this unit will make history." The Army tested the Blitz Buggy for approximately 20 days, from late September through mid-October, putting it through grueling evaluation. This was not gentle testing. The Army wanted to break the vehicle, to find its limits, to discover every weakness before committing to production. Tests included rough terrain and cross-country courses with ditches, hills, and deep mud that would have stopped most vehicles. Hill climbing that saw the prototype successfully conquer a 35-degree grade on the Holabird test track, steeper than most mountain roads. Water crossings at 18 inches depth. Corduroy log surfaced roads designed as accelerated life testing, the jarring impact simulating years of rough use in weeks, and highway driving with full payload to test endurance and speed. Any malfunction lasting more than 24 hours would have meant disqualification. Frame cracks occurred during testing, the stress of the brutal evaluation finding weak points in the hastily assembled prototype. But Bantam's mechanics swiftly repaired each failure, sometimes working through the night to have the vehicle ready for the next day's tests. The prototype proved superior in fuel economy, braking distance and steering compared to the competitors that would arrive later. What happened next remains one of the most contentious episodes in American industrial history, a story of wartime necessity, government power, and the destruction of a small company that had achieved what the giants refused to attempt. While Bantam's prototype underwent testing at Camp Holabird, the Quartermaster Corps forwarded copies of Probst's detailed blueprints to both Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company. The government claimed it owned all designs submitted in the bidding process. Engineers from both companies were allowed to examine and photograph the Bantam prototype in the Camp Holabird garage. They were present during the entire testing period, given what sources describe as ample opportunity to study the vehicle's construction, suspension geometry, body design, and mechanical layout. This design sharing happened before either competitor submitted its own prototype. The Willys vehicle, called the Quad, arrived at Holabird on or about November 11th, 1940, nearly 7 weeks after Bantam's delivery. It bore a strong resemblance to the Bantam BRC, using the same Spicer axles and transfer case and mimicking the rounded grille design. The Ford prototype, called the Pygmy, followed on November 23rd. Both drew heavily from Bantam's pioneering work, though Ford introduced a flat hood and grille design that would ultimately be adopted into the standardized Jeep. The War Department justified its actions on multiple grounds. Bantam's small factory, with fewer than 500 workers, could not meet the Army's projected need of 75 vehicles per day. Even at maximum capacity, Bantam might produce 10 or 15. War was imminent, and the military needed hundreds of thousands of vehicles from reliable mass producers. The government asserted it had paid for the development and legally owned the designs under standard procurement rules. Bantam's co-founder Roy Evans chose not to initiate lawsuits, fearing the Quartermaster Corps would kill Bantam's contracts entirely in retaliation. A small company could not fight the federal government during wartime and hope to survive. As one historian summarized, the sharing cut out a great deal of legwork for Willys and Ford and took away Bantam's advanced development advantage. The Haggerty Automotive publication called it one of the most perfidious acts in the motor industry. Bantam's president, Frank Fenn, protested directly to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. In a documented letter dated March 23, 1942, Fenn wrote that he could not understand how Bantam had been denied a chance to bid on large-scale production when it had performed the major part in the Jeep's development. Fenn noted that Bantam had paid Spicer more than $130,000 in tooling costs for axle production, in reasonable expectation of benefiting from Jeep production. Harry Payne, Bantam's retired Navy pilot turned military lobbyist, brought the matter to Senator Harry Truman, whose investigative committee on military procurement was examining waste and favoritism in defense contracting. Truman's committee helped pressure the Quartermaster Corps to give Bantam some compensation. The resulting compromise, reached in November 1940, ordered 1,500 pre-production vehicles from each of the three companies. But even this compromise would not save Bantam in the end. The competition ultimately came down to engines. Bantam's Continental four-cylinder produced 45 horsepower. Ford's modified tractor engine managed only about 42 to 45 horsepower and was widely criticized for reliability issues during testing. But Willys Overland had a decisive advantage: the Go Devil engine. The Go Devil was an inline four-cylinder flathead, producing 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and 105 foot-pounds of torque. That far exceeded the Army's 85 foot-pound requirement and outgunned both rivals by a wide margin. In military vehicles, power meant capability, the ability to climb steeper hills, carry heavier loads, and maintain speed through difficult terrain. The engine was not a new design. Chief Engineer Delmar Roos, a Cornell-educated veteran of Locomobile, Marmon, Pierce Arrow, and a decade as Studebaker's chief engineer, had modernized the old Willys Whippet 4 over several years. He added insert bearings for durability, a counterbalanced crankshaft for smoothness, lightweight aluminum pistons for responsiveness, full-pressure lubrication for reliability, and improved breathing for power. The original engine could run continuously for only 2 to 4 hours before overheating or failing. Roos's version could run 100 hours or more on the dynamometer, tough enough for combat conditions. Roos faced a critical choice when confronted with the Army's weight requirements: scrap his heavier but more powerful engine for a lighter one to meet the weight specification, or keep it and shed weight everywhere else. He chose to keep the Go Devil and undertook what became legendary in automotive engineering circles. He disassembled the entire vehicle and analyzed every single component for weight reduction opportunities. He shortened bolts, cotter pins, and studs by fractions of an inch where strength allowed. He substituted tough alloys for carbon steel in the frame, saving weight without sacrificing durability. He replaced body panels with thinner gauge steel. He eliminated one coat of paint from the finishing process, saving approximately 10 pounds. Every ounce mattered. He met the Army's revised weight limit with just ounces to spare. It was an engineering tour de force, a demonstration of what a major manufacturer could achieve when motivated. The Infantry Board's final verdict was unambiguous. Willys' performance was superior to that of Bantam and Ford in acceleration, maximum speed, grade climbing, and cross-country capability. The reason lies in its greater horsepower and torque. In July 1941, Willys Overland was awarded the first standardized production contract, 16,000 Jeeps at $738.74 per unit. The model was designated the Willys MB Bantam had proven the concept. Willys would build the weapon. By October 1941, it became clear that Willys alone could not meet military demand. Ford Motor Company was brought in as a second-source manufacturer, retooling its facilities to build Jeeps identical to the Willys design, including the Go Devil engine manufactured under license. Ford designated its version the GPW, G for government contract, P for Ford's 80-inch wheelbase designation code, W for Willys licensed design. Ford stamped every component, down to individual nuts and bolts, with a script letter F to ensure proper credit and identification. Ford also designed the now iconic stamped 9-slot grille, lighter and cheaper to manufacture than Willys' welded slat version. Willys adopted Ford's grille design in early 1942, a final irony in a story full of borrowed designs. The production numbers tell the story of industrial scale that Bantam could never have matched. American Bantam produced approximately 2,675 Jeeps in total, across all variants, from September 1940 to December 1941. Willys Overland produced roughly 1,555 pre-production models from June to August 1941. Then approximately 359,000 standardized MB models from November 1941 to September 1945. Ford produced roughly 4,458 pre-production GP models from February to August 1941. Then, approximately 277,000 standardized GPW models from January 1942 to September 1945. Combined total production reached approximately 647,000 Jeeps, roughly 182,000 Jeeps, nearly 30% of total production, were shipped to Allied nations under Lend-Lease, including approximately 50,000 to the Soviet Union and tens of thousands more to Britain. Bantam's contribution to that total was less than half of 1%. What did the soldiers who drove these vehicles think of them? The praise was universal and often eloquent. General of the Army George Marshall is widely attributed as calling the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. This attribution appears across virtually every authoritative source, including Jeep's official history, the George Marshall International Center, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and United States Army publications. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote in his 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, that 4 other pieces of equipment that most senior officers came to regard as among the most vital to our success in Africa and Europe were the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 aeroplane. Curiously, he noted, none of these is designed for combat, but perhaps the most eloquent tribute came from Ernie Pyle, the Scripps Howard war correspondent who became the voice of the ordinary American soldier. On June 4, 1943, writing from North Africa, he published these words in his syndicated column. "Good Lord, I do not think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It is as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going." Pyle also described it as a divine instrument of wartime locomotion, language that captured how soldiers felt about a vehicle that could be trusted to function in the worst conditions imaginable. Pyle himself was killed on April 18, 1945, on the island of Iishima near Okinawa, when a Japanese machine gunner opened fire on the Jeep he was riding in with Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Coolidge. Captured German generals, interviewed by United States Army historian Hugh Cole after their surrender, stated they admired the Jeep more than anything else in the formidable American arsenal. The Wehrmacht had nothing comparable, no light vehicle that combined the Jeep's mobility, reliability, and versatility. The Jeep served in every theater of the Second World War and performed virtually every conceivable military function. Reconnaissance, its original purpose, allowed commanders to gather intelligence rapidly. Ambulance and litter carrier configurations evacuated wounded from the front lines when larger vehicles could not navigate the terrain. Weapons platforms mounted 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns, bazookas, recoilless rifles, and even flamethrowers for direct combat. Communications vehicles laid telephone cable across battlefields. Light artillery tow vehicles hauled 37mm anti-tank guns into position. In the Philippines, mechanics fitted a jeep with flanged steel wheels and used it as a railroad locomotive, pulling a 52-ton supply train for 19 miles at 20 miles per hour, when no actual locomotives were available. The jeep was small enough to fit inside American Waco and British Horsa gliders, allowing airborne units to bring vehicles into combat immediately upon landing. Special rigging allowed jeeps to be dropped by parachute, though the landing was rough and recovery time consuming. Soldiers improvised constantly, finding new uses the designers never imagined. Chaplains celebrated communion on the flat hood. Officers used it as a briefing platform, spreading maps across the engine cover. Engine manifolds heated sea rations when field kitchens were unavailable. Radiator water served for shaving when no other source existed. The British Special Air Service made the jeep an offensive weapon in North Africa. By mid-1942, SAS teams mounted Vickers K machine guns on their jeeps for hit-and-run raids deep behind Rommel's lines. These desert raiders would strike airfields, supply dumps, and communications centers, then disappear into the sand before the enemy could respond. On the night of July 26th to 27th, 1942, 18 SAS jeeps stormed the Sidi Hainish airfield in Egypt. The raiders destroyed or damaged 37 Luftwaffe aircraft in approximately 15 minutes, shooting up planes lined along the runway before speeding away into the darkness. One man was killed during the raid itself. On Guadalcanal, a Willys MB nicknamed Old Faithful became the first Marine jeep to land on the island during the initial assault on August 7, 1942. It served 4 Marine generals over the following months, transporting commanders through jungle terrain that no other vehicle could navigate. It took 2 shrapnel holes in its windshield during Japanese battleship shelling on October 13th, yet continued functioning. Over 18 months, Old Faithful travelled more than 11,000 miles of jungle tracks, mud roads, and combat zones. It became the first American vehicle symbolically awarded the Purple Heart, a testament to how soldiers viewed their vehicles as comrades rather than mere equipment. Cartoonist Bill Mauldin, whose Willie and Joe cartoons won the 1945 Pulitzer Prize for his overall body of wartime work when he was just 23 years old, created one of the war's most famous images, a grizzled cavalry sergeant pressing his .45 caliber pistol against the hood of his disabled jeep, covering his eyes before delivering the final shot. He was treating the machine as one would a horse with a broken leg, unable to watch the mercy killing. The cartoon captured something profound about the relationship between soldiers and their jeeps, and what became of Bantam, the company that started it all. Of the jeeps Bantam built, more than half were shipped to the British Army and Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. Relatively few served with American forces. After losing the standardized production contract, Bantam pivoted to manufacturing approximately 92,000 trailers of various types, including quarter-ton Jeep trailers that would be towed by the very vehicles Bantam had invented and others now built. The company also produced torpedo motors for the Royal Navy, gasoline engines, canvas truck covers, aircraft controls, and axle assemblies. Total major wartime contracts reached more than $40 million. The company won the Army-Navy E Award 3 times for production excellence, beginning December 21, 1943. The last American Bantam civilian car rolled off the production line on August 18, 1943, as the factory converted entirely to war production. After the war, Bantam continued making utility trailers for the consumer market, but the damage was done. The company had lost its opportunity to grow into a major manufacturer, relegated to trailer production while competitors built the vehicles Bantam had invented. When Willys Overland applied to trademark the word Jeep on February 13, 1943, Bantam filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC investigated Willys' advertising claims. On April 27, 1948, the Commission issued a cease and desist order. The order prohibited Willys from representing, directly or by implication, that Willys Overland, either acting alone or in cooperation with the United States Army or any other agency, created or designed the automotive vehicle known as the Jeep. The FTC found that the Jeep was the result of the combined efforts of the Army and the several manufacturers who participated in the project. Despite this ruling, Willys persisted in its claims. On June 13, 1950, Willys was granted the registered trademark for Jeep. The word that had become synonymous with American military power now belonged to the company that had built the most units, not the company that had invented the vehicle. By that time, Bantam, absorbed by a Willys-controlled subsidiary around 1947 and stripped of valuable tooling, had sought bankruptcy protection. The company that invented the Jeep was destroyed by the companies that built it. The factory passed through various owners. Armco Steel Corporation acquired the remains in 1956. The property went from Armco to AK Steel in 1999, then to Cleveland Cliffs in 2020. AK Steel's Plant 2, which included the original Bantam site, closed in 2004. In November 2020, the property sold to a development company for $2.6 million for redevelopment. Most of the massive complex was demolished. The original Bantam administrative building, where Probst dusted off those drafting tables in July 1940, was initially spared for its historical significance. Then, on November 2, 2025, it was destroyed in a fire lasting approximately 4.5 hours. Butler's mayor called it deeply unfortunate and an important part of Butler's proud heritage. Karl Probst returned to freelance automotive consulting after the war. He never sought public credit for his contribution to the Jeep. He never wrote articles or gave interviews about his role. He never complained about the $200 he received for designing one of the most important military vehicles in history. In 1962, battling cancer, he wrote up his account of the Jeep story for the first time, 22 years after the fact. He never sought publication during his lifetime. The account was published posthumously in 1974. He died on August 25, 1963, in Dayton, Ohio, at age 79. His original Jeep drawings were reportedly spread open on his bed when he passed. Those drawings were later burned by a daughter-in-law, lost to history. His son Charles told historian Bill Spear that when asked who really designed the Jeep, Probst would say simply, "The industry knows." He did not need public recognition. He did not need monuments or awards. He knew what he had done, and the people who mattered knew too. A street in Caen, France, near the Memorial pour la Paix Museum bears his name, a Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission marker, erected in 1993, reads, "In September 1940, a team headed by Karl Probst delivered to the United States Army a prototype for the World War II Jeep. This small four-wheel drive vehicle was produced by the American Bantam Car Company, located 1 block east." In 2015, the Pennsylvania General Assembly adopted House Resolution 382, commemorating the 75th anniversary and recognizing that Bantam of Butler was instrumental in creating the Jeep. The Bantam Jeep Heritage Festival, launched in 2011, set a Guinness World Record for the largest Jeep parade in its first year, with over 1,000 vehicles. By 2024, it drew 2,200 Jeeps from 30 states and 25,000 spectators. The verified historical record establishes that American Bantam created the original Jeep prototype, but the final production vehicle was a collaborative product shaped by multiple hands. Harold Christ conceived the layout. Karl Probst drafted the formal engineering blueprints in roughly 2 days. Together with a small team, they delivered a running prototype 30 minutes before an extraordinary deadline. The Army then shared those blueprints with competitors who had the manufacturing scale Bantam lacked. Willys Overland's Go Devil engine, not its design work, won the standardized contract. Ford's production capacity made mass deployment possible. A quartermaster corps lieutenant named E.P. Hogan wrote the most honest assessment in fall 1941. Credit for the original design of the Army's truck, quarter-ton, 4x4, and may not be claimed by any single individual or manufacturer. This vehicle is the result of much research and many tests. But that assessment, however accurate in its technicality, obscures a deeper truth. Someone had to go first. Someone had to take the brutal deadline, accept the extreme specifications, and build something that had never existed before. Someone had to prove it could be done before the big manufacturers would even consider trying. That someone was American Bantam, a tiny company in a small Pennsylvania town, 15 workers, one freelance engineer who initially said no, a chief engineer who had developed designs before the blueprints were drawn, and 49 days to change the course of the war. They did not receive the contracts they deserved. They did not receive the credit they earned. The company that invented the Jeep watched others build it by the hundreds of thousands, then watched its factory get torn down, and finally watched its last building burn. But every Jeep that rolled off the assembly lines at Willys and Ford carried the ghost of that first Blitz buggy in its frame. Every soldier who rode one into battle owed something to the men in Butler who proved it could be done. General Marshall was right. The Jeep was America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. What he did not say, what almost no one ever says, is where that contribution actually came from. It came from Butler, Pennsylvania, from a bankrupt car company, from an engineer who worked for $200, from 15 workers who built something extraordinary in 49 days. It came from American Bantam. If you found this story worth hearing, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates the real stories behind the machines that shaped history. And if you want to see more untold stories from the Second World War, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.